Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to the grid. I'm Joel, aka the Blur Grammar, and this is a breakdown of Kang the Conqueror. If you've never read the comics before, and more specifically, this is a series on Kang the Conqueror that will uncover the differences and the similarities of Kang the Conqueror in both the MCU and in the comics. So, if you've never read the comics before and you want to know a little bit more about the history of Kang, this is a series for you that you want to stick around for. So, grab your popcorn if you need it, and let's get right into it. So, this is the second part of our series in the Kang series that we're talking about, specifically in the uncovering of the MCU versus the comics. And in this particular series, we are talking through the epic collection of Only Myself the Conqueror, which is the Kang the Conqueror version or epic collection of Kang the Conqueror. Last left off with Nathaniel Richards hurling himself through the timeline and encountering Rama, basically in before the fourth year of the Kang dynasty. This is where Nathaniel Richards assumes his rightful position in the timeline currently from jumping from the other Kang version that as soon as Nathaniel lands inside of this timeline, there is a battle that ensues and pretty much almost kills him, which would be a annihilation of another Kang variant if that were to happen. There's a whole lot going on in that in this comic, but basically this is a sighting of Nathaniel going against all of the henchmen of Ramatut, basically his entire army at this point. But then we get a Moon Knight sighting inside of this comic that is a very welcome surprise. After the battle is over, we then uncover the identity of Moon Knight, and we find out that the person inside of that suit is Ravonna. So if you don't know, there's actually a Ravonna sighting inside the MCU, inside of Loki. Again, she is basically inside of the same arc as He Who Remains. So the fact that both of them are inside of the TVA, basically inside of Loki, is a telltale sign that Ravonna is going to be a very big part of Kang's story inside the MCU arc. But when we see Ravonna in the comics here specifically, she is donning or has donned the identity of Moon Knight, and it is not Mark Spector or any of the other versions of Mark in this case. So what I'm thinking about is, was she the very first Moon Knight when Ramatut was on the scene at this point? When Nathaniel hears the name Ravonna, he freezes, just like any Kang anywhere in the entirety of Kang. He always freezes when he hears the name Ravonna. Hey, hit the like button, just do it. He hears it when he's first coming in contact with the future version of himself in Nathaniel Richards. I'm talking about here. He comes into contact with that name in the future version of himself in Kang the Conqueror. And then when he hears it for the first time personally, it's because of a woman that just saved his life. In the events happening before she uncovered herself, literally she came through riding on a horse, killing all, or at least the people that were trying to kill him directly inside of that army for Ramatut. All of that happened, and now he hears the famous name Ravonna that he has heard once before, but now it's more meaningful for him because he now remembers that the person that killed his first love was brought to their knees because of that same name. Now he feels like that is happening, or basically the love that he had for the woman that he had before is now turning, it looks like, towards Ravonna. And that is where the catalyst of everything that we've been talking about in terms of love is starting to happen. In the events that happen after Ravonna reveals herself, it's basically Nathaniel telling her that I'm lost, or Nathaniel the Lost is basically what he names himself. And basically because he's, again, a time traveler at this point, everything that he does, he considers himself a misplaced person inside of the timeline because he's always trying to time travel in everything he's doing. So he's finding himself completely lost because he doesn't know exactly where he is. Obviously, he has no idea where he is now because he's in a different part of the timeline. What am I saying? But inside of that conversation, Ravonna then tells him no one's ever really lost when you come into contact with Khonshu. She then tells him to prepare himself to communicate with Khonshu, and basically brings about the powers of Khonshu and allows Nathaniel to go back inside of his mind and realize that the promises that he made to himself to annihilate the previous version of Kang that he encountered are still real, and he still understands and feels those feelings that he felt in the beginning when Kang actually destroyed the village that held the woman that he loved. So at that same point, he then breaks open and remembers all of the conversations about love that Kang had with him. The main purpose of that being never to fall in love. Inside of their conversation, Ravonna asks Nathaniel, is the place where you came from basically going to remember this place, or does it remember this place, which in this case is the ancient Egypt version of Ramatut's reign? I believe it's the first or second year, because the Fantastic Four hasn't annihilated him yet, and that only happens in the fourth year. But inside of this conversation, she asks him a very pertinent question, and the back and forth of this conversation basically lends me to believe, or lends me to think, that the placing or the framing of this scene or space inside the comics is a direct port inside of Loki, where Sylvie and Loki are actually having their heart-to-heart before they come in contact with the thing that engulfs them into the other part of the timeline, which basically brings them to the He Who Remains variant of Kang. And in the same fashion as before, where Kang, again, if you remember, going back to the previous pages of the events before, literally Kang comes back into Nathaniel's memory and tells him, never love, but as soon as he comes into physical contact with Ravonna, he immediately falls for her as well, because again, going back to the fact that he comes from a utopian place, everything is sterile, he's never had any physical contact, so as soon as he has it, it literally makes him crumble again, and it makes him susceptible to love, which again brings his guard down, and that's when Ramatut strikes. When Ramatut does capture Ravonna and Nathaniel, he then uses the same ultra diode ray that is being used inside, or at least from my perspective, being used in the same flashback that Kang had in the previous version of the encounters with Nathaniel and Kang the Conqueror. So when Ramatut uses that exact same technology, it's the first time that it's actually used, and inside of this comic, it's basically being brought up as the origin of that being used the very first time. But I don't believe inside of this comic specifically that's the first time we actually see it. I believe that that actually happened, or a version of that actually happened to Ravonna inside of the flashback that we saw when Kang had his meltdown before. But when this actually does happen, when Ravonna actually gets hit with that ray, a weird twist of events happens when Nathaniel calls out to Nathaniel inside of Ramatut at the same time, basically saying, stop this, Nathaniel. And when it happens, Ramatut then realizes who he is and then says to him, you. And Nathaniel then says, yeah, it's me. Basically, both of them are realizing that I'm you and you are me in the same time, or at the same time in different places in the timeline. So again, going back to the theory of two Kangs being inside of Quantumania, in every single time in this comic, at least up until this point, we've always seen two variants of Kang inside of the timeline. One is good, one is trying to annihilate the other one. So I believe, again, this is going to happen inside of Quantumania as well. But let's move on into the rest of this comic. And basically the rest of this comic is straight up from there. The immersion of that conversation, the realization of Ramatut realizing that Nathaniel is him in a different timeline, we also see the immersion of Iron Lad, which is basically the start, or at least the starting point in this case, of the Kang variants and Nathaniel Richards in himself, understanding that this basically comes from, or at least the way that the comics portray him, as giving or having nanotech inside of his body, basically from the Iron Man suit. So he probably understood how to make all this stuff from Tony Stark, because again, in his utopian world, everything literally can be made from scratch because it already has been. It's already been conquered. So he goes and finds the technology, at least from the way that it looks, finds the technology and puts it to use. And when he needs it, he calls upon it literally from out of nowhere, because before all of this, we never knew that he even had this technology in him. But as soon as he's angry enough, it comes directly out of him. So he turns into Iron Lad in this place, or in this part of the comic, and then we start to see more of Ramatut and the conversation of Iron Lad and Ramatut basically in this scenario. In the entirety of that scenario, basically what Ramatut is trying to do is make Ravonna one of his wives, if you know what I mean. So he then uses the diode ray or ultra diode ray and brainwashes her, or make it. It doesn't necessarily brainwash, but it makes you susceptible to anything and everything that the owner of that ray is trying to make you do. You don't have any free will at that point. So she's completely locked away from her own free will. That sends him, or Nathaniel, into a frenzy because he loves her now. And that is again the reason why Kang told him never to love, because that is why it enrages them and then brings them into a place where they can't control themselves anymore. After the realization of Nathaniel and Ramatut basically coming together, there's a conversation that they then have between each other when Nathaniel, or Iron Lad at this point, tells Ramatut that Ramatut is basically a footnote in the epilogue, that in the full story that is theirs, and he doesn't even know their true name in this case of Ramatut, basically saying this from Nathaniel. So at the same time, we can see that Ramatut is contemplating killing him, slitting his throat, which is basically the way that Nathaniel has his injury in his own timeline, and it's basically the same thing that carries through even in before he comes into contact with Moon Knight, or Ravonna in this case. He almost had his throat slit then. So in that conversation, Nathaniel then tells him, hey, if you slit my throat, you probably will be doing your own undoing, because you don't even know who you really are, and you are really just a footnote in the overall story of who we are. So Ramatut decides, you know what? That's a valid point. I'm going to just use you, because killing you will be stupid, but using you will be strategy. So he actually takes the same ray that he used on Ravonna and uses it on Nathaniel here as well, telling him to become a Centurion for him. And basically this is where we get the Scarlet Centurion from this portrayal of his armor, which is basically where the fusion of Iron Lad and Ramatut kind of come together, basically because inside of this situation, Ramatut says you can go to the front of the line, and when you do that, go ahead and make your armor a little bit more suiting for your position, which is basically telling him the current suit of armor that you have right now is not going to work. In his time as the Scarlet Centurion, he goes on a rampage, literally same type of feel that we got from the very first time that Kang shows him how to kill and do all these kinds of things. Feels like the same thing, although this time it's a little bit more on a grander scale, because Nathaniel is now fully enraged, and because of the fact that now love has tainted him, he completely goes full over to that rage. And that's the thing that happens, again, going through their plumb line from this comic. Everything hinges on love, because if you don't deal with it, it becomes a catalyst or a callus on them and literally sends them into a full-on rage. But Nathaniel's rage is held together by the fact that he wants to annihilate Kang. So he leaves that it's literally imprinted in his mind, so that when he comes back into contact with Kang again, he is going to kill him, or at least he's going to try. And basically after all of his conquests are done and he comes back to ancient Egypt, he now sees that it is no longer there, and that's because it is after the 4th year of the dynasty of Kang, which as this is going on, we actually see the thoughts that are happening inside of Nathaniel's mind, which is basically from the point that Ravonna is hit with that ray, and then he basically says that the will that they did have to fight and scream and fight back and all that kind of stuff completely went away, and so did the love that he once had at one point for humanity after he becomes the Scarlet Centurion. When Scarlet Centurion Nathaniel returns back to ancient Egypt after swearing that he's going to annihilate Kang, over and over and over again, he then realizes that the woman that he loves, Ravonna, is also probably gone as well. But he then tells himself, or at least in the comics, it says that he tells himself a lie that basically no one is lost in the light of the moon, which is what she tells him when he says that he's a nomad, basically. All of that leads me to believe, again, this is the origin or the reason why when he hears the name Ravonna, it literally captivates him, because he just wonders, is she alive? Is she dead? Did she actually make it out of that 4th year of the Kang dynasty? All that stuff comes up for him when he comes back to ancient Egypt and realizes that it's after the time that Ramatut is actually supposed to be annihilated. He then enlists the powers of Insummoner and basically this is inside of a Egyptian coffin, basically, is where he's going to do his time travel. But in this case, it's not going to be the same way that he time traveled before. This time he has to go through, at least the way that Insummoner says this, in the way that the sun or the moon would actually do this, or in natural situations. So technically it's just through time that he's going to encounter Kang again, but it's still going to be time travel in this case. So hopefully in this series, if you've never read the comics, this has been an enlightening situation for you in the previous video and in this video. Again, I would appreciate if you spread this around to as many people as you possibly can, because you want to get this information out before the movie comes out for Quantumania. But if you did like this video and you want to stick around for more content like this, go ahead and subscribe, and I would appreciate if you go ahead and like this video as well. And until next video, blurred out.